I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like. Yes, what's up, world? Welcome to I Mix What I Like right here on Black Liberation Media. I'm Jared Ball, very happy to be your host. We have a very special show for you this morning, featuring, of course, Josh Ingram, Black Men Build, Black Liberation Media, Associated Crews. Good morning, good morning. And we are joined by a very special guest, welcoming back to the platform, Dwayne Omowale, author, activist, journalist, here to talk about his latest book, Walter Rodney, A Political and Intellectual Legacy. Fellas, good morning. Welcome to you both. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Peace. Thanks for having me.
Quickly chat, we are not live, though today everyone is technically, I think, off. Many of us are off celebrating the U.S. and its finest presidents. So I can't think of a better, but we are not live. But I still think the best way for us to pay homage and tribute to the United States and its presidents is to talk about African Revolution and Walter Rodney. So, but anyway, so peace. So listen, Josh set all this up. Salute to you for quarterbacking this. All I can say is I've done my homework and I'm ready. So I'll let you take over and lead us. I will push some buttons, and I'm looking forward to getting into this. And again, salute to the undefeated chat. I'll check back in with you all later and get all the correct answers from you then.
Okay. Peace, everyone. I'm Josh. I also go by Lord, Black Men Build, organizer out of Miami. And today we're going to follow up on something we started last year. There's an episode, Dialectical Historical Atheism. If you go back and check that out, we're building something, what we're going to call the Black Atheist Tradition. And so this will be a series. We'll try and do it each month. And we're going to define what that is. To be clear, not all of our guests will be atheists. They can be people of any faith or spiritual background. But we are talking about where we're coming from. And again, building that into a revolutionary history, right? Because we're all trying to unify and struggle together. In that effort, we've invited Brother Omowale to join us today. And Jared, if you could go ahead and pull up the slideshow, we can go ahead.
Absolutely.
And I'll give you your proper introduction soon, Brother Omowale. So, everyone, we are still working on ironing this out, but if you remember last time, there was a challenge in the chat. There were some questions. There were a few things. So we're going to come back, address those. And today we're going to focus specifically on Walter Rodney.
Just real quick, is there a way for me to present this?
It, not make it full screen? Yeah, let's figure that out.
Yeah, that would be kind of cool here.
How did you do it last time? That's the real question. Did we just make it?
Actually, I don't even remember. Did we use this last time?
Yeah, definitely.
All right. Well, I'll work on that. I don't need to hold this up.
Maybe. Maybe we could just try and zoom in, make it full screen. Let me see.
That doesn't work.
Let me see if this will work.
That doesn't help.
We could do
slideshow, start presenter view.
Presenter view might be helpful if we try that.
There we go. Does that work? Okay, there we go. Boom.
Yeah. Boom. All right.
Hold on. That deserves. Hold on a second. I deserve a pat on the back for that. I just want to just pat, but I'm just playing my back away.
Good. So, y'all, this is the Black Atheist Tradition, episode 2. We're going to call it the political and intellectual legacy of Walter Rodney. And it is, of course, based on this book right here. And we are with the author right now. If you could go to the next slide, Jared.
Yep.
So this is not, I am not officially here on capacity of Black Men Build, but I am a Black Men Build organizer. And I try and move through the world, embodying our values. And so I want to acknowledge them here because I think they can be a great way to ground the show. And I think they will drive how we engage the Black atheist tradition. So the value, number one, is that we are critical thinkers. Number two is we are curious about this moment. Three is we are coming together to take an active, responsible role in freeing our communities. Four, we are transforming to meet the moment. And then five, we are bonded with Black women and all Black people in the fight for true freedom. Black people who choose to fight for the enemy or use our struggle for personal financial gain need not apply. This is how we introduce people to our organization. To just get started, you sign that values pledge, and then you come as you are and grow as you go. So that is, I think, a very healthy way of engaging any sort of political thought, but also how we try and move through the world. If we could go to the next slide. Jared and I have also been trying to define the Black atheist, and I was happy that you were willing to acknowledge it and be like, yeah, that's a thing. It is our social experience. It has been here for a very long time. And these three core features are how we're going to define it. So, Jared, if you don't mind, it's going to be a little bit like class, Professor J&J here, reading this.
No problem. No problem. So the Black atheist tradition, number one, rejecting colonizer capitalist religions and fighting their destructive impact on the colonized, especially the African diaspora. Examples, Hatuey, is that pronounced correctly? Deborah Clark, George Jackson, Richard Wright, James Baldwin. Number two, exploring the social experience of nonbelief, deconversion stories, challenging supernatural or faith-based claims, philosophical debate, scientific inquiry, and secular morality. And then third, sharpening the dialectical materialist method.
And we are very, very tapped in on number three. I think what's interesting about all of these is that, for example, number one, you don't actually have to be an atheist to do that. So I think that is very important. We're talking about a tradition, and not everybody is going to cleanly fall into it, say that they are an atheist, all of these things. But we are defining it this way, at least as we choose to experience it. Of course, there are a broad variety of experiences. Now, with those two things being laid out, we can get into today's episode. If you could go to the next slide, Jared. So,
challenge number one. Okay, yeah, my bad.
This is homework. Professor's here. This was homework from December. So it's to drop your favorite resources on dialectical and historical materialism in the comments. Oh, we got a few that I thought were excellent. And so I'm going to share that document later. In the show description, we'll put it, and all the challenges will be tracked there. So you'll be able to see some. The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte by Karl Marx was suggested by Danny Schaefer. Conscientism was suggested by the Yazid who reads. And then one I really enjoyed, A Dialectical Approach to Culture by Sekou Touré, was suggested by African Period. So if you have more suggestions, please drop them in the chat. We're collecting them and we are using them. So very, very helpful stuff. We'll move on.
Right on.
That.
We move next.
Yeah. Chat in the comments, y'all. Chat in the comments. Drop them down. We'll keep it for, let's say, 3 episodes, and then we might switch to a new challenge, but we definitely want to get as much as we can from here. We also talked about some of our own favorites. Of course, Walter Rodney's name came up, which is why we're doing this. If you could go to the next slide.
Yeah, and what I'm also going to do is make a playlist specific to this atheist series.
Cool. So who is this handsome gentleman joining us today? Brother Dwayne Wong Omowale was born in Georgetown, Guyana in 1991. He is a Pan-African activist and author who specializes in African and African diaspora history. Welcome, Brother Omowale. How you doing today?
I'm doing well.
Can you tell us a little bit, so some of us in the States don't get geography, very well, unfortunately. And so even recognizing Guyana's in South America sometimes takes whoa, wait a minute,
Most people think
there's a map there, there's a flag.
West Africa, yeah.
But can you tell us a little bit about yourself, what it's like in Guyana, a little bit about that background?
Yeah, so yeah, like I said, Guyana is interesting because most people confuse Guyana with Ghana, so they think Guyana is a country in West Africa. But what also gets people with Guyana, because culturally and politically, Guyana is a Caribbean country, even though it's located in South America. So that's also something that can kind of confuse people if they're not really familiar with the dynamics about that. But the reason why that's the case is because of the history of colonialism. Guyana, being a former British colony, tended to historically and culturally align with other British colonies in the region, the British colonies in the Caribbean islands. So that's a little background on just why Guyana is a unique country in South America, that even though it's located geographically in South America, it's more so Caribbean culturally and politically than it actually is Latin American. But the thing too about Guyana's history and politics as it relates to Walter Rodney that's particularly interesting for me being able to write this book is my mom was actually involved in that struggle in the Working People's Alliance movement in Guyana. She actually used to attend some of Walter Rodney's lectures, and members of the WPA, they would actually hide the material at her house, because Guyana being a dictatorship, one of the things that Burnham's government would do is actually raid the houses of different activists in the WPA, and if you had any material that was considered incriminating, you could be sent to prison for doing that. So my mom had a neighbor who was in that movement, and he would actually hide protest signs and other material at her house, so that when the police stopped by to interrogate his house, they wouldn't find the material at his house. So, for me, writing this book, it's a bit more personal than most topics that I've written about because of my connection to that history via my mom.
Wow, that's an amazing overview. And is it geographically, or I should say, in terms of climate, is Guyana similar to the Caribbean? Because I saw the map and it looks like Georgetown is on the coast. So it looks like a lot of the cities are coastal. Is that
yeah, and actually that's part of an issue in the country as well. The majority of the country is coastal because, again, colonialism, the way that the Dutch and the British established that colony. But the reason why that becomes a problem is majority of the population lives on the coast, but the native population, the Amerindians, most of them do not live on the coast. So it creates a situation where they're essentially neglected and cut off from the rest of the country because of where they're located at geographically. But most of the country is located on the coast. And in terms of the climate actually is very similar to the type of climate you'd find in most Caribbean islands.
Mm-hmm. So we have an African population that was brought over, and we have an Amerindian population. How did those two groups interact, if you don't mind me asking, historically?
Yeah, so historically, what it was, that, as I said, the Amerindian population, they were the native population. So when slavery happened and Africans were coming over, essentially what the Europeans would do is typical divide and conquer tactics, where because, as I pointed out, the Amerindians tended to live further inland in the country, so they understood the geography of the country in terms of the wooded area, or what we call like the jungle area in Guyana. So it was a situation where if Africans tried to escape, run away, they would be the ones that would actually go in and capture them because they understood the layout of the land. Mm-hmm. So essentially, the Amerindians were used as slave catchers during the period of slavery, and they were also used to help to put down slave rebellions. So that was how the Europeans were using the Amerindians against the African population. But once slavery ended and Amerindians didn't serve that usage anymore, then it created a situation where they essentially were isolated from the rest of the country. Because, as I pointed out, most of the development of the colony was done in the coastal areas, and Amerindians living further inland in the country were completely isolated from that development. So, and it's like that to this day in Guyana. It's still a situation where Amerindians feel very much neglected. And when we talk about the racial dynamics of Guyana and how it plays a role in the politics, Amerindians are actually the third largest racial group in the country behind Africans and Indians, but they don't have the same political representation. So whereas the PNC in Guyana is known as the African Party and the PPP is seen as an Indian party, there's no major Amerindian political party representing the Amerindians.
Sure, that's pretty complex history. Sounds similar to some stuff that happened in the U.S. and that still limits Black and Native solidarity here. So love to ask you some more about that, and I'm sure we'll get into it. But I just wanted to get us started with a little bit of who you are and why you're tied to this. So thank you. And thank you for that background. Jared, if we could jump to the next one. I guess this is important, right? What are we grounding this work in? So again, there is Omowale's great book. I love it. It's also very short, very readable, 90 pages. Was that intentional by you?
It's intentional, yes.
Okay, good. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you. You don't understand.
But you covered. I'm sorry, but you covered a lot of ground in it too. I mean, you hit a lot of the main points that people would want to know about and debate about, and so yeah, it's impressive to have done so much in such a relatively small space.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think you really get to the core of his life and scholarship, and that's what we're going to get into today. Some other books to ground. Walter Rodney Speaks, The Groundings with My Brothers. These are fantastic, of course. All of his collection is, but some short, solid books. Let's start with a fun question. Do you like y'all like the new cover or the old cover for Groundings with My Brothers? This is easy. Have y'all seen the original one? Like when you
not only do I prefer the original cover, I prefer the original edition because there were some slight changes in terms of the fonts and certain things.
Oh, really? I didn't know that. This is the Verso Books version. I think it's pretty. It's cute, and it like goes with a series of publishings. But if anyone's seen the original, it's the actual brothers that are being grounded with. You know.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. That's what I thought. You know what? I'm glad you brought that up because I was having my own little. I was like, I don't remember this being the cover, and I remember you see the. But it didn't click for me. I thought maybe what I was remembering was like something pictured inside the original book and not the cover. But you're right. Yeah, that's wild.
No, the original cover is Malcolm and Garvey and a few others.
Right.
Nkrumah's on there as well.
Yes, I definitely see his face, and it looks older, which I like. It's like got a retro aesthetic to it. Yeah. It looks like you find it in those African bookstores, you know, somewhere. But
yeah, here it is. Here I just pulled up. People can be reminded.
Yeah, that one exactly, right? So okay, all right. We prefer. I wish I like the newer. It's sleek, but I do kind of wish it were closer to the original. All right. Anyway, moving on. So those are some other books you can read to get started. I wanted to maybe just talk about grounding itself. So Jared, if you could go to that next slide. But Omowale, I'm gonna ask you to read. That's how we do in our study circles. So if you could, spoilers. No, if you could go ahead and read this slide. Fantastic.
So I have sat on a little oil drum, rusty and in the midst of garbage, and some black brothers and I have grounded together. So that's from Walter Rodney. And this next quote: grounding is a practice, a way of living. It's not just a word, it's how Walter Rodney lived his life. And that's by Dr. Patricia Rodney. And the final statement here, the term groundings in the Caribbean vernacular refers to deep, often informal conversation or exchange of ideas at a grassroots level.
Is that accurate? So I'm Caribbean through my grandfather, but I'm not, actually tapped into that island yet. So is that
yes, accurate. Yes, yeah.
Okay, cool. So grounding, this, I guess, conversation would be what I'm trying to model as a grounding today. So hopefully we can do that. And grounding also is referred to a way that you center yourself and who you are, what you do this for. So a way B&B we do groundings is with who do you love? So I wanted to open the space up with that kind of grounding. So we asked, who do you love? It could be a person, it could be your dog, it could be whatever. So Brother Omowale wanted to ask, who do you love?
Who do I love? I mean, this kind of put me in the spot there because, I mean, obviously family, but, on a deeper level, just over the course of the work I've done as a Pan-Africanist, I've just encountered, so many people that have assisted me with this work. And those would be, I mean, outside of immediate family, I would say those would be the people that I love.
Jared, who do you love?
Oh, well, my babies, my wife, my dog. And I love everyone trying to have this liberation struggle. Mm-hmm. I actually do love people engaged in struggle. And then I also want to shout out, I also have Dilla love. I also have Jay Dilla in the spot. You must be in love. So I have that. And then if you've been to a Dilla party, may he rest in power, you are commanded by the best of DJs to express your love for those who have Dilla love in the space. So I have Dilla love as well.
Bet. I'll ground it with what I'm wearing today. It's my cousin. Passed away recently, but that's who I love, my family and my people. And the last conversation we had was about Black history in Miami around some of our own family. So I do this for her as well. So I want to ground it in that. And let's get started.
Right on.
Well, we already started, y'all, but let's get into it for real. Okay, if we can jump to that next slide. So you sent us this. I loved it. I think it's legendary. Can you explain a little bit of context, as we're talking about Walter Rodney today and his legacy? What is this document that you sent us on this page, and why did you think it was relevant to understanding groundings?
So I wanted to send it because, you know, you mentioned reading the Groundings with my brothers. Obviously, that was a book that Walter Rodney wrote after he was very famously banned from returning to Jamaica. So because of, you know, the circumstances behind that banning and the rioting and everything, I think most people, when they know of Walter Rodney and the situation that he encountered with different Caribbean governments, they know of the situation with Jamaica and being, you know, barred from Jamaica. But I think what often, you know, gets neglected, and even just, you know, the general history of this time period in Caribbean politics, I think we overlook the fact that it wasn't just Jamaica that banned Walter Rodney. It was several other Caribbean governments that did it. And this was a particular document I actually found years ago when I was doing research on the topic. It's the Government Gazette from St. Vincent, and it lists a number of political activists that were banned from St. Vincent at the time. So Walter Rodney being one of them. Another name I'm sure many people would recognize upon reading the document is Stokely Carmichael Kwame Ture. He was barred from St. Vincent. He was also barred from Trinidad, which was interesting because he was born there, so he couldn't even go back. He couldn't legally go back to his own home country. So that's why I want to send the document, because it's something that I came across, and it really helps us to understand that, you know, this was larger than just Jamaica. At the time, many Caribbean governments were banning people like Walter Rodney, banning people like Kwame Ture, because the ideas that they represented were seen as a threat to those governments. And to give a bit of a historical and political context, you have to keep in mind that for many Caribbean countries at the time, this is shortly after decolonization. So these are supposedly independent Caribbean countries, but yet these same governments are banning people like Walter Rodney, banning people like Stokely Carmichael, banning people who are representing the Black Power movement. And the contradiction we see there is, if these nations are really so independent, why the fear, why the concern with Black Power and what Black Power represents? Yeah.
That's huge. It seems like almost a rite of passage for a revolutionary in the Caribbean. Like, you're too radical, they won't even let you go back home. That happened with Garvey as well. He was expelled from Jamaica. Is that true, or am I mistaken on that?
Not expelled in the way that Kwame Ture was, but the thing is, after he was deported from America, he went back to Jamaica and he tried to get well, he did get involved in politics in Jamaica. Actually, he was elected to public office, but because what Garvey was doing in Jamaica was a direct challenge to the colonial government there, he actually was harassed and jailed on one occasion. So he wasn't expelled or barred in the way that Kwame Ture was, but he encountered a lot of those types of resistances. And actually, that's part of the problem as well, that you think about the fact that, again, in a post-colonial Caribbean society, why are Caribbean governments utilizing the same tactics that the British colonial government used to suppress the activities of certain political activists?
Yeah. I maybe, since I was mistaken on Garvey, I think Claudia Jones was also banned from Trinidad, and that's why she ended up in the UK. But I have to look back at that. But that's tough and deep. Okay, can we?
And then she got locked up here too, right? Where was she locked up?
She was locked up in the U.S. with her comrade Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, if I'm not mistaken. Right. Yeah. And then they had segregated jails back then, so they couldn't even stay in the same cell, which was crazy. So yeah, deep history there. I wanted us, we've been doing Josh and Jerry React, so how Walter Rodney's legacy lives on. I think it's inspiring a lot of Africans, and it will continue to do so as long as we face the struggle we face. So, Omowale, if you wanted to, I saw this video essay about Walter Rodney. It's kind of creative, dialectical, if you will. And I wanted us to maybe watch it together, react, similar to what we did last time. Does that sound cool?
Okay.
Yeah, cool.
In order to understand where we are and how we got here, we need to grapple with history. As I submerge myself in the molecules of the past, attempting to diagnose the condition of this system, I found it difficult to pin down what has actually happened. I reflected on how history was taught to me in school, and I realized that it was severely lacking in substance. It was like standing in the shallow end of a swimming pool and being told that I was in the Atlantic Ocean. There were special occasions where we'd remember anniversaries, but it seemed like we only touched upon a few major events which centered around a handful of people. When we learned about Black History Month, it didn't really extend beyond Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech or the fact that Rosa Parks sat on the back of a bus peacefully. And the little that we did learn about the transatlantic slave trade, we weren't told why it happened and certainly not the role of the United Kingdom. Today, the world seems to be in complete disarray. And in my journey to get to the bottom of this vast ocean of history, I found myself descending to levels that the sun's light can't even reach. It certainly hasn't been smooth sailing, as much of Africa's recent history is soaked in a lot of pain. Wading through it all has been rather challenging. A novel that illustrates this particularly well is called The Deep by River Solomon, which is about an underwater civilization of mermaids who are descendants of pregnant enslaved Africans that were seen as too much of an inconvenience to be kept aboard slave ships. The Deep takes this tragic historical fact and imagines an alternate reality where Africans were transformed into mermaids and developed a utopia away from the dystopia that Africans above the waters were subjected to.
Can we pause?
Instead of imploding under the pressure of the deep ocean, the Wajiru people thrived.
Real quick, first question. That described how I was experiencing Black History Month in the US, but it sounded like this author was talking from the UK. And then I don't know about Guyana. So can you speak to how y'all have Black History taught in Guyana? Is there a Black History Month? How does that kind of work?
So this is interesting, actually. From my observation, it seems as though within the last few years, there's been a Black History Month in Guyana, which actually coincides with Black History Month in America. But typically in Guyana, the educational system is still very much colonial. So as a result of that, a lot of Guyanese history actually is not taught in school. So, for example, again, going back to Walter Rodney's books are not actually used at universities in Guyana. That's a critique of the universities in Guyana that I've seen for a while now. And what's interesting about that is almost a situation where Walter Rodney's intellectual impact seems to have it seems to be more engaged outside of Guyana than it actually is within Guyana, because as I pointed out, it's not taught there at the university. But I mean, on a deeper level, it's not only that his ideas aren't taught at the university, but even just his politics and what he represents, that's not part of the public discourse anymore within the country. And it's not just Walter Rodney. A lot of important historical figures in Guyana either are not mentioned, they're not really taught in school, or if they are, their ideologies and what they represented, similar to what happens with Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King becomes I Have a Dream. So what happens to certain political personalities in Guyana? They become caricatures of who they are, and their actual political ideologies, what they represented, really, it's not discussed in the mainstream. To give a particular example, the People's Progressive Party, PPP, the founder of the party, Chedi Jagan, was actually a Marxist. And recently, the PPP dropped Marxism from its official documents. It's no longer in its constitution. So that's the type of thing that I mean, that within Guyanese society, Jagan's political party, the PPP, they continue to honor him and acknowledge him as the founder of the party, even though they've completely strayed away from his actual political ideology. So it's a similar situation in Guyana, where a lot of historical figures are simply never discussed, and the ones who are discussed are typically discussed disconnected from their actual political ideologies and what they represented. So as I pointed out, it's the same thing that's done to Martin Luther King. We see that happening as well in Guyanese societies.
Since we're about to get into a little bit of fiction, I know, Jerry, you're coming off of discussing fiction as well. What about Rodney's children's books? Because I know he made Lakshmi out of India and Kofi Badu out of Africa. Are those circulated, read in Guyana?
Not that I'm aware of. From what I've seen, people have been saying that those books should be circulated, taught in school to school children, but I haven't seen where that's been implemented. So that's typically the critique on that. At the primary school level, the books that Walter Rodney wrote for children are not being taught, and at the university level, his books aren't being taught as well. So, as I pointed out, Walter Rodney's become a figure where most people in Guyanese society would have heard of Walter Rodney. I don't know about Walter Rodney, but I would imagine not many Guyanese could actually tell you much about what he stood for and what he represented. And I mean, that's partly the fault of the educational system, but also partly the fault of the political parties as well. As I pointed out, what the PPP did with Chedi Jagan, we see a similar thing with the WPA on Walter Rodney, and even the PNC, the People's National Congress, Forbes Burnham's political party. It's a similar situation. So unfortunately, the political parties themselves actually play a role in the fact that a lot of these political figures are just reduced to being caricatures of who they actually were.
That's very similar to the U.S. since we're doing Pan-Africanism today. It's very, very similar.
No, but and this is how similar it is, because same thing, just like Martin Luther King, because of him being assassinated, and I see the same thing though with Malcolm X as well. They're not here to speak for themselves. So it creates a situation where anyone could use those individuals to promote a particular agenda. Same thing is done with Walter Rodney. There's many different people in Guyana who use Walter Rodney to promote a particular agenda. And because Walter Rodney isn't here to represent or to speak for himself, it becomes very easy to do that. So yeah, unfortunately, when we talk about Pan-Africanism, a lot of the issues that Black people face in America, especially Black leadership, same issues we find in Guyana as well.
So the only thing I could think of that would complete the parallel would be if the party that presided over Rodney's assassination led the way in developing both a national holiday and a national monument for Rodney. That's the only thing I think that would make it, not to compare in this way, but that I think would make it as bad as what has been done to King here. I think that's the next stage of the abuse is to actually actively promote them as being something they weren't in that way. But
you don't
there's
want
hope
Rodney
for the
$20
future.
bill?
Yeah, right.
What's a Rodney 20?
or a Tubman-esque salute as if he helped spy on the state, whatever they, with whatever they did with. So yeah.
Jared, to that point, I was actually thinking of your earlier coverage of like the King Memorial with Walmart and all of that. And when I actually went to DC, speaking of how Rodney's books aren't there, growing up, I never thought King had books. Like I didn't know he wrote books. All you see is like speeches. Like I thought he was a pastor, just like Malcolm. I just thought all he did was speak. And then you go to the gift shop and it's all these books by white people about King, but none of King's books in any of these places. So I think that's, poetic. But we can continue.
Yeah. So it can get worse, in other words, is what we're saying. So, here we go.
The culture exists in an almost permanent state of mindfulness, encouraging their people to be as present as possible and not dwelling too much on the past.
By the way, this seems dope as a concept.
Every year, however, they have a remembering ceremony where the historian, keeper of all memories, shares everything with them before taking the memories back for another year. This is seen by most to be a good compromise. They're able to hang on to their history while avoiding the long-term pain of remembering. The trade-off, however, is that the historian has to carry that burden alone for the rest of the year. They have to endure the suffering for the sake of their people. The novel is centered around the historian Yetu, who's finding it increasingly hard to deal with the daily anguish of the past. The disassociation with the present makes it hard to stay tethered to reality. One day, Yetu makes a choice that may fundamentally disrupt the peace that the Wijeru people had known for centuries. And the consequences of holding on to unresolved traumas may or may not lead to an unbridled tsunami of rage. The Deep shows the importance of fiction and how it can be used to reimagine history without rewriting it. The novel was inspired by a song of the same name, written by David Diggs, a member of a band called The Clippings, and they were inspired by Drexciya, an American electronic music duo from Detroit, Michigan. It's like a game of artistic telephone, an open source approach where these slight adjustments in the retellings are a feature, not a bug. The Deep is a work of fiction, which is where these kinds of utopian fantasies work well. But when it comes to analyzing our reality, I'd argue that a more scientific approach is preferred. History is not as objective as it seems. The prevailing narrative is usually written by the victors to make themselves look as noble as possible. For instance, the United States celebrates Christopher Columbus Day every year and his voyages into the so-called New World. But the mainstream media barely mentions his atrocities against indigenous people or his role in the slave trade. Our view of the past is also limited by our technological and scientific capacity. For instance, when the theory of evolution was discovered, it reshaped the history of humanity and life in general. It was revealed that the evolution of life is a process, and the assumption that Homo sapiens were static beings entirely separate from the other organisms on this planet was no longer valid from a scientific perspective. A common view of the development of human society is that societal paradigms don't really shift until a five-headed genius who's ahead of their time comes along with a new idea and changes everything. For instance, people like Tesla, Galileo, and Da Vinci are all placed into this category. And although they made some important contributions, this view often downplays the contributions of humanity as a whole and the cumulative intelligence that went into a particular breakthrough. I think a more interesting view of history should factor in the society as a whole. If we were to look at the major historical changes, it seems to be tied to what we are able to produce, the mode of production, and the people's relationship to those things. When humans entered the agricultural revolution, surpluses were created for the first time, and that allowed for certain humans to specialize in particular fields, meaning there was a greater division of labor than before. Some people had different relations to the mode of production than others, and consequently led some to have more power than others. This also applies to feudal relations between lord and serf, as well as our current epoch, that of the employee and the boss. In order to transition from one epoch to another, it requires a certain level of development. And over time, those quantitative, incremental developments lead to major qualitative paradigm shifts. This also applies to the natural world as well. Heat up a cup of water, 1 degree at a time, and not much changes except for a gradual rise in temperature. But once you hit 100 degrees, all of a sudden that liquid boils and evaporates. Similarly, in human societies, certain discoveries would not have been made if it weren't for the prerequisite tools, technologies, and insights that already existed from centuries of tinkering around to make things more refined or efficient. Failing to acknowledge this may lead people to believe that the problems that we face today will be solved by the sole ingenuity of the startup entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley, as opposed to the thousands of employees that do most of the developing, and all the Africans and people in the global south who mine the resources under inhumane conditions to power this globalized system. Some people, to their credit, may acknowledge that this system was built on the backs of enslaved Africans, which is true, but not much is spoken of the impacts that it had on the African continent as a whole. Walter Rodney contributed a great deal in this regard with his 1972 book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. He acknowledged that, like many other places on Earth, Africans were developing before the arrival of Europeans. According to Rodney, a society develops economically as its members increase jointly their capacity for dealing with their environment. This capacity for dealing with the environment is dependent on the extent to which they understand the laws of nature, science, on the extent to which they put that understanding into practice by devising tools, technology, and on the manner in which work is organized. Some places in Africa were living under primarily communal relations, which meant that the land belonged.
So we can just go, so far, I feel like this is an accurate outline of Walter Rodney's historical method. How are you all viewing this video so far?
Yeah, I would agree.
And then what I wanted to ask, there were two things. The first thing was this discussion of fiction as a way of understanding the world versus a scientific approach, because the author talks about which one is preferred. Could you speak a little bit about how Walter Rodney had to engage that dynamic of understanding fiction in this place, but also a scientific view of the world?
So that's interesting, because I think fiction in this context is actually referring to fictional stories that are being utilized to essentially fulfill a type of emotional psychological need among the masses of the people. And I can't really speak to what Walter Rodney's position on that would have been, because I think to some degree, I think fiction is important. I mean, particularly when we talk about an oppressed people, I think it's important that oppressed people can create certain, fictional stories and narratives that can make us, feel better about our circumstances, give us, a sense of hope and understanding. So, as I said, I can't really speak to what Walter Rodney's position on that would be, because I haven't encountered him speaking on that in any of his, lectures I've listened to or his writings. So I could just give my perspective. And as I pointed out, I think, to some degree, it is necessary that people have these stories, to fill these needs. But, what Walter Rodney was concerned with, and, ultimately what my activism, and I would argue most people who are really committed to Pan-African activism should be concerned with, is the actual material conditions of the people. And that's to say that you can make people feel good. You can, give people a sense of hope and optimism about their situation by providing fictional stories. But ultimately, what people need is an advancement in the material conditions. People need to be fed, people need to be sheltered, people need to be taken care of. So really, that's ultimately the objective of Walter Rodney's work. It was centered around advancing the material conditions of working people, advancing the material conditions of the masses of African people globally. So, from that perspective, Walter Rodney was more so concerned about the actual material conditions of African people rather than just filling people with a sense of hope and pride. And as I pointed out, the video is talking about fiction in terms of actual fictional stories. But one thing that Walter Rodney was very careful about, and one thing that Walter Rodney has been a great influence on me regarding, is not using history to create that fictional narrative, not using history to fulfill that psychological and emotional need. And it's very difficult because, on one level, when you think about the struggles of African people, we're struggling against a racist colonial system that told us that we didn't have any history, that we were just savages and cannibals in Africa. So when we look toward history and we could point to these great civilizations in Africa and these great achievements of African people, it does combat that racist narrative, and that is a necessary aspect of a struggle to combat the racist narrative. And it's also necessary, as I pointed out, to fulfill the psychological need of African people so that we could have pride in our history, so we could have a sense that we are human beings. We're not, people who are just savages and beastly, and we weren't civilized by Europeans. So these are important emotional, psychological needs, but it can't just stop there, and the history can't just be about that. So this is something that Walter Rodney understood, and so his approach to history was something that I would argue was more holistic, that Walter Rodney understood the power of history in challenging racist colonial narratives, the power of history in terms of humanizing African people, fulfilling those emotional psychological needs. But he also understood the power of history in terms of really understanding history on that materialistic level, understanding history in terms of the material conditions of the masses of people. So to that extent, Walter Rodney was not one of those Pan-African historians who had a romantic view of African history, didn't romanticize African history. He didn't try to present Africa as being a utopia. He was very honest about the fact that there were certain contradictions that existed even within Africa's own internal development, and those contradictions were ultimately things that European colonizers were able to exploit to their own benefit. And something that I go over in that book was the fact that a particular contradiction Walter Rodney spoke about was the class contradiction between African kings and chiefs, the ruling class, and the regular ordinary workers, the masses of Africans in African society. So Walter Rodney points out that when the slave trade began, ultimately it was the ruling class, the African ruling class, that was in cooperation with Europeans in terms of enslaving the ordinary masses of African people. So Walter Rodney was pointing out that this was an internal development within African society, an internal class differentiation within African society that Europeans were able to exploit to their benefit. And I think the problem with creating a utopian vision of Africa is it really doesn't help you to understand why it is that we were conquered in the way that we were, why it is that Europeans were able to do what they did. But Walter Rodney understood that, as I said, there's an important psychological aspect to history, but we also need to understand history from a more materialistic standpoint and not just try to use African history to create a utopian romanticized narrative, because ultimately it doesn't really help us understand the conditions that we face today, and it doesn't really help us to understand how to move forward in terms of addressing our conditions.
So can I just quickly add, as I was listening to that, I think great answer. I was trying to think of a way to tie the theme of the series together, because as I'm listening, I'm thinking, one of the reasons, one of the areas of study that has helped sort of ground me in my atheism is my understanding of the material basis for the mythologies that became made literal from the African world and turned into religious stories and meant to be told as literal histories. And those original myths were very much tied to a material understanding of the universe and the world. And we're trying to convey that, to have the stories convey a materiality to young people, or just as a way of conveying. And then, but the fear is what happened, that the materiality, the grounding gets severed. The myths become taken as literal and then turned into something else. So yeah, if worldview, consciousness are emanate themselves from the material conditions, then the stories that reflect that immateriality should inform and encourage material engagement and work in that way. I think dialectically, if So yeah.
We're definitely going to touch on, first off, I know you wrote the book because that's the exact quote I pulled. So we're going to get to it next, but that is perfect what I wanted to get to. His evidence-based approach to history is huge, extremely important. And then again, to this series, Jared, it's like, I appreciated the discussion of fiction and the value of fiction. And I think, Brother you were there. It's not a problem. It's like it's filling needs for us, psychological needs, social needs, even political needs, right? This is what fiction has done historically. But in this, it's very clearly grounded. People are not assuming or substituting this for the material history. So the way that book was described, we all know mermaids are, well, we don't know that. Some people believe mermaids are real. We know mermaids are a fictional thing. We could see how there was a person. We know the actual people who wrote the text. And then we could see the dialectics of art and culture, how tied to a Detroit metal band and all sorts of cool stuff like that. So I think it's very valuable to understand that, but contextualizing it properly as fiction. And I think this author said, when talking about our history, he prefers a more scientific approach. So I thought that was very valuable, and we'll definitely get into a little bit more of that. I also like this short 13-minute kind of overview of what we get into with, this really thick one. So if we could just continue this video.
Belong to the people living on it. For example, a family, or on a slightly larger scale, a clan of people coming together to accommodate each other for various reasons. Things weren't all sunshine and rainbows, but it must be noted that cooperation was usually preferred over competition. On the other hand, there were places that resembled the feudal relations of Europe and Asia, where the mode of production had developed further, such that it required a greater division of labor and specialization. In other words, African cultures did experience a degree of uneven development across the continent, just like other places in the world. The key thing to recognize is that prior to the transatlantic slave trade, the gap between Africa and Europe wasn't as clear-cut as it is now. Furthermore, when Europeans did arrive, they were pretty impressed by the masonry, metallurgy, quality of fabrics, architecture, and more. And in some cases, they preferred the craftsmanship of Africans than their own goods. It follows that a certain amount of development had to have been present in order to be in a position to specialize to that degree. Africa's development was interrupted, leading to a stagnation of economic development. As Rodney states, the underdevelopment is a product of imperialist and colonialist exploitation. African and Asian societies were developing independently until they were taken over. When that happened, exploitation increased and the export of surplus ensued, depriving the societies of the benefit of their natural resources and labor. This is an integral part of underdevelopment in the contemporary sense. It could also be argued that African development actually regressed because the knowledge that was acquired, whether it's scientific, mathematical, philosophical, musical, religious, or otherwise, was simply forgotten in many cases, erased like footprints on the beach, and replaced by the economic incentives of Europe and America. Just imagine if you were forbidden from practicing a certain skill. After a certain amount of time, that knowledge will fade, and it won't be passed on to the next generation. For centuries, Africans could not reap the rewards of their own labor. They could not develop those incremental changes that would have led to the paradigm shifts that I mentioned earlier. Those leaps were had in the West, where they didn't have to bother as much with hands-on agriculture and instead spent most of the time developing their industries. Even James Watt expressed his gratitude to slave owners who essentially financed his steam engine. In other words, the capital required to develop the West is entangled with the super exploitation and underdevelopment of the global South. And after the colonial era ended, the gap had widened so much so that it would seem to the untrained eye that Africans were backward people who hadn't contributed to anything of merit to history. The most pernicious reason for this is that it's some kind of genetic inferiority, the same reasoning that was used to justify the exploitation in the first place. In 2020, this hasn't changed all that much. Africans are still subjected to systemic racism, and in the global South, Africans are still being subjected to the same super exploitation that has been going on for centuries. Justification often given is that Africans have to deal with these conditions until they become as productive as Western nations. But if that were true, Africa would have developed by now, considering the inconceivable amount of labor that has been expelled over the centuries. In addition to this, Africans at home and abroad are often used as shock absorbers for the inherent instability of the system. And even in cases where the Western working class had struggled for better conditions, Rodney claims that the Global South often had to carry that burden to ensure that profits could still be made. And at the same time, those concessions tended to pacify those working class people so that they'd stop challenging the underlying contradictions of the system. This is an uncomfortable truth to come to terms with, but I think it's worth considering in trying to fully understand the scale of the problem we face. We live under a global system, and in order to deal with the global problems that we face, global solutions are required. Unless we understand the inner workings of the system and how interconnected the different sectors of the economy really are, everything we do will be at best band-aid solutions and at worst a deepening wound that will cause more complications down the line. Utopian fantasies are fine. The Deep was a very enjoyable novel and provided the temporary escape that I needed while studying the atrocities that Black and Indigenous people had to deal with. However, I also recognize that I have to come back to our present historical moment to be grounded within these material conditions in order to formulate a scientific pathway to a fully automated, post-scarcity sustainable planet. We can't just wait for the elites to have a change of heart, finally addressing the increasing wealth inequality or climate change or even systemic racism. They simply will not budge until the global masses decide that enough is enough. So don't shy away from history. Learn from it. There are valuable lessons to be learned from past successes and failures. And remember, we don't stand on the shoulders of giants. We stand on the shoulders of Gundams that have been operated by billions of people throughout history.
So that's the end of the video. I enjoyed that. The last piece of anime reference is a little complicated for folks who don't watch that, but everything else is pretty fantastic. Any other reactions toward that video, things that made you think about?
I love the conclusion, the overriding point, a lot. I mean, it's
now listen.
I mean, it's very bars to me to remind people that there is a collective that produces everything and all the possibility, the knowledge, the materiality that people build from, literally. I mean, all of that. So yeah, I love that point. Yeah.
Any thoughts, Brother Omowale?
Yeah, I think I agree. The ending message was very powerful, and to bring it back to Walter Rodney, that was the thing that Walter Rodney had always stressed. He developed the slogan "People's Power, No Dictator," and I think the people's power part is important because, as the video pointed out, really what creates change is the activity of the masses of people. And again, it goes back to how we approach history. And Walter Rodney was very keen in understanding that history is not just a story of great, outstanding individuals. History is also the product of the masses of people who often aren't necessarily recorded in history in the way that people like Napoleon and certain great historical figures are recorded, but that the masses of people throughout history have really been the driving force to shape history. So again, that's why that's why it's important to truly understand and have a proper approach to how we study history, because I mean, even in the discussion we've been having today in terms of certain historical Black leaders, I think it's also important to understand that even these individuals weren't just outstanding individuals; they're part of a larger movement, so that you don't have a Malcolm X or a Martin Luther King or those type of individuals in the United States without the larger movement that was taking place. And it's the same thing in Guyana. You don't have a Walter Rodney without the larger anti-colonial movement and the things that were taking place in Guyana and throughout the Caribbean. So it's important to understand that really the masses are the drivers of change throughout history.
I appreciate you outlining that. And I appreciate your work highlighting the atmosphere, the community, the material conditions that produced a Rodney, that it was a collective thing. And I think that sets us up perfectly for the transition into what that method looks like. So what is the historical materialist method? Rodney's considered a Marxist historian. These next 3 slides are excerpted from something that I've been putting together with comrades around dialectical materialism, how we're defining it, how we're coming to understand it. So I thought these 3 things would be great. From Walter Rodney on what is Marxism. So this is us speaking, the folks who wrote this document, but it must be understood that Marxism is simply a name for a field of study or a method for viewing society, is not an inherently European discipline, just like film or medicine aren't inherently European. While Marx has been deemed the field's founding father, Guyanese revolutionary Professor Walter Rodney preferred to call the discipline scientific socialism and defined it as such. Scientific socialism, or Marxism if you like, is an explicit worldview which contemplates every conceivable phenomenon, from protein to literature, like we just saw, in terms of a methodology applicable to nature and society. So that was from Tanzanian Ujamaa and Scientific Socialism, 1972. So I really think it's important to understand that for Rodney, Marxism was just a term for the method. And that method that we're talking about is dialectical materialism and historical materialism, which we've been focusing on a lot.
So he wasn't walking around with pictures of Marx in his wallet and on his necklace. And
next slide, Jared. Next slide. We're here.
Okay.
We're here. Yeah,
okay.
Go ahead.
All right. Just checking. Okay. My bad. Just checking.
Okay. Actually, yeah. Go ahead, Jared. Read this next, and then actually the slide after this is what you were getting at. But we're here.
Marx practiced scientific socialism by applying a specific worldview and methodology called dialectical materialism to understanding the political, economic, social, and ecological structure of his society, 19th century industrial Europe. Historical materialism is the application of dialectical materialism to the analysis of history. Famous examples include Black Reconstruction by Du Bois, Women, Race, and Class by Angela Davis, and Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, Capitalism and Slavery by Eric Williams, the man who banned Kwame Ture, and How Europe Underdeveloped Africa by Walter Rodney.
Contradictions.
Yeah.
Also, on the side, we have African Americans in the New History of the USA by Gerald Horne as a modern example for folks who are looking for that. So yeah,
who wrote that book in the 5 minutes in between each of these slides, and 3-4 others probably too, right?
Exactly. This is pumped out with his other library. I was also trying to just talk about defining dialectic materialism. This is why we've been focusing on it so much. If you all go to last episode, you'll see where we try to break it down piece by piece. And throughout this series, we'll keep trying to piece together how we define dialectical materialism. But I think that's really important. And then next slide, and Brother Omowale can read this one. To your point, Jared, because we've been talking about the Eurocentrism, we've been talking about the age-old, never-ending debate about, is this a European thing? Is it an African thing? Is this a white man telling us how to have revolution, right? So I always answer that with our revolutionary elder, Asada Shakur, just two dudes. Can you read that quote for us, Brother Omowale?
All right. So usually after a disagreement, they, referring to my comrades, suggested I read this or that, often Marx, Lenin, or Engels. I prefer Ho Chi Minh, Kim Il-sung, Che, or Fidel, but I ended up having to get into Marx and Lenin just to understand a lot of the speeches and stuff Huey Newton was putting out. It wasn't easy ready, but I was glad I did it.
Typo, reading. My apologies, y'all.
Okay, yes. Reading. Okay, that's what I thought. It opened up my horizon a hell of a lot. I didn't relate to them as great white fathers or like some kind of gods, like some of the white revolutionaries did. As far as I was concerned, they were two dudes who had made contributions to revolutionary struggle too great to be ignored.
All right, y'all. So you heard it here. This is how we are approaching Marx. I don't want to see any more comments about this is a white guy and he's just a dude. Engels was just a dude. And they were dudes who applied a method that anybody can apply to their society. And so the limitations of that method was the limitations of their own understanding at that time in that society. These are just two dudes. So that's how.
But I also agree with the way she ends it there, that their contributions are too great to be ignored. That they are, their contributions are great. Two dudes. But they did contribute something, and we shouldn't ignore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah,
that's it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's how we're approaching this, y'all. So they are just regular guys who wrote some things, studied some things, organized, just like we're trying to do here. We don't look at them as any different. We're not idolizing them. I don't even think you'll see Marx in my bookshelf. I got most of his stuff online anyway. So just so you know.
I always take down my statue before we go live.
Right, exactly. It's not you gotta hide it. You gotta take it over
usually right there.
But they were two dudes, and they did a great contribution to revolution. That's why we're talking about them. So that is how we're grounding. We'll go over some other classic quotes that we use to understand dialectical materialism, but I think that's fantastic. If we move on to the next slide. All right, we don't have to keep this up the whole time. I can read them, but you broke this book down into 4 chapters. They're great. The Making of a West Indian Intellectual, Africa's Development and Neocolonialism, Race and Class, Marxism and Pan-Africanism, and finally, Rodney and the Working People's Alliance. So I'm going to try and bounce some questions off based on each chapter. And some of these are coming from my comrades. So they're tuned in to hear their questions answered. And Jerry, you can knock it off the screen. We could just read it from behind the scenes. All right. So first chapter, The Making of a West Indian Intellectual. What is Rodney's understanding of the role of intellectuals, and how did he come to embody the guerrilla intellectual who uses their knowledge in service of the working poor?
So his particular understanding of the role of the intellectual is that the intellectual should essentially put themselves at the service of the masses of the people, at the service of the working class. And why that was particularly important is because Walter Rodney never saw himself as leading any type of movement. He didn't see himself as a leader of the people. He always saw himself as working in service of the people, working in terms of the type of things that the masses of people needed. And it was particularly important for Walter Rodney as an intellectual, because he understood that in post-colonial Caribbean society, too often intellectuals became part of the neocolonial system that was oppressing the masses of the people, that these were intellectuals who typically worked at the university, worked at institutions, who not only would not challenge the system, but live fairly comfortably off of the situation that we find in post-colonial societies. These were intellectuals. And I mentioned it in the book as well, that Walter Rodney didn't particularly care for being around these individuals when he was in Jamaica. These were individuals who he saw them as being completely disconnected from the masses of the people. So he believed that the importance of the intellectual is that the intellectual is in a position to be able to study, in a position to really understand the society. So for Walter Rodney, it's important as an intellectual to, as we pointed out before, groundings, to ground with the masses of the people, to give that information back to the people, to really get them to understand the different forces that are at play in terms of, what keeps them oppressed, what keeps them struggling in the situation that they're struggling in. Because Walter Rodney understood that it's often a situation where the masses of the people who are struggling are not even necessarily given the tools or given an understanding of why it is they're in the condition that they're in. And again, that's why history is so important for African people, because a lot of us really don't understand why it is we're even in the conditions that we're in as a people, because we don't even know the history. We don't really understand the politics behind what's happening. So Walter Rodney felt that it was important that as intellectuals who really understand this history, who really understand the dynamics of the oppression of African people globally, that it's important that we go before the masses. And when when I say go before the masses, actually go find the masses where they're at, connect with them where they're at, and really give that information to them. And in Jamaica, Walter Rodney was going across Jamaica, and he mentioned it in his book. Even some of the poorest areas in Jamaica, he would go and find people and would have those groundings. So he was an intellectual who was actually going and trying to connect with the masses where they're at, rather than just locking himself up in a university and living comfortably as the masses are struggling outside of the corners of the university.
Yeah.
Can I just say, yeah, no, I just wanted to ask real quick, because in this first of all, I gotta say, forgive me for this, but my one slight critique of the book is I do wish you would have given us a few more footnotes for some of the references. In some cases, there are some quotes that I couldn't quite identify where they're coming from, and I think that would be very helpful. For instance, because I did want to ask, this is really the question I wanted to get to. When you talk about, for instance, you said the intelligence files explain early in 1963, Rodney seemed to have, quote, been politically inactive, probably because he was preparing for finals. Could you talk about, just say a word just quickly, because I know I don't want to take us off from Josh's questions too much, but could you just say a word or two where you got that, and then could you and explain how early were they already surveilling him? Like what? Because I admit, like I'm thinking of his later work, and already in '63 they're on his final schedule. So like, could you? Yeah.
But so I will start off by saying that actually is a very valid critique because, and not just this book. Typically, in my books, there's not a whole lot of footnotes, and the reason for that is because I'm not writing, books that are intended to be extremely academic. So typically, I'll put a reference section for people who want to follow up on the things that I've written about, so they could find where I'm getting the information from. But it's not written to be academic, so it's not going to be as precise as having the actual footnote. So that's the reference section. So it is about
it's a Howard Zinn type of like the way he did people's history. I get it.
It's Rodney critique too. I mean, Rodney wasn't the best with citations.
I was going to say. Like
so
Rodney.
Say quickly, because I get it. Like, I don't want to be seen as the academic, and that's why I'm not saying it for that. I'm saying it for the reasons you're saying, that it does make it easier for people to get immediately exactly where this is coming from. So that's, I get.
So like I said, it's a valid critique because typically when you're writing for an academic audience, that's why you do it, so people could get to the exact source. But to answer that question, if you go in the reference section, actually it's an article by Michael West on Walter Rodney and Black Power, Jamaican intelligence and U.S. diplomacy. So, but to get to the second point of your question, they were surveilling Rodney as a university student, and part of why they were doing that, as I explained in the book, because they became aware of the fact that even as a student in university, Walter Rodney was connecting with groups that were seen as being very radical. I mentioned in there that Walter Rodney's going to Cuba, taking trips to the Soviet Union. So they were already looking at Walter Rodney, and he was very active as well in terms of trying to organize things on campus. So even as a university student, Walter Rodney was somebody who stood out as, the intelligence community was looking at him like, this guy might be a problem at some point because of who he's connecting with, the countries that he's going to, the type of things he's trying to organize on campus. So that's why they were having him under surveillance, because they had already recognized that, this is somebody that looks like he could be a problem in the future.
Right on.
And you're not off topic from my questions at all. That's exactly the kind of stuff I wanted to go through. Speaking of, two dudes, like I did like reading this and getting into Rodney's head. And like when you hear his background, his wife describes him as a fun-loving teenager who loved to dance. When he would show up in places, right? Like he's just a dude who liked playing cricket, and they're like, this is a professor, and he's mad young. So in some ways, I actually do see myself in him, including when he's on campus and he's like, God, these bougie niggas get on my nerves. Let me go hang the rosters and leave campus so I can actually growl with people. So I very much appreciated that. And I do appreciate what you mentioned about the masses, or particularly I like the term working poor. I actually really like that term. I think it's a term that intellectuals, academics can't really run from. And I think Rodney was very intentional with how he spoke about certain things. So, all right, that's chapter 1. The making of voice Indian intellectual. There's far more in there. I got the whole damn chapter underlined, but we're going to just stay focused. So next. You call chapter 2 Africa's Underdevelopment and Neocolonialism. Rodney's analysis of Africa informed a generation of revolutionary thinkers and offered a framework to think about capitalism, imperialism, and colonialism. He critiqued what are called neocolonial regimes as maintaining colonial power relations. Why is his analysis still relevant today?
It's still relevant because we still have the same neocolonial regimes. And as some background to the term neocolonial, that's something that Kwame Nkrumah actually came up with, because what Kwame Nkrumah recognized is the contradiction of independence, that even though African nations had independence, fundamentally they were still controlled by the same Western powers that had controlled them during the colonial period. And Walter Rodney, in the book, I mentioned it, that he refers to it as a type of constitutional independence, where these post-colonial states create a constitution, creates a national flag, and have the outward appearance of what would seem to be independence, but in terms of who actually controls the economy, who actually controls the real important decisions that are made within the nations. It's not actually the leaders within these nations themselves, but it's still the same Western colonial power. So that's essentially the neocolonial system, that even though these are independent societies, it's the same economic, political relationship between the former colonies and the colonial powers. But what makes neocolonialism much more challenging to deal with than colonialism, and this was a point that Kwame Nkrumah made as well, that because of nations being officially colonies, it created a sense of I don't want to use the word accountability, but I mean, essentially that's what it was, that as the colonial power, there was still some degree of accountability to the people that you're colonizing, because officially they're under your jurisdiction, they're under your rule. Now, what Kwame Nkrumah recognized, the problem with neocolonialism, is that there's no accountability. You know, officially the United States is not accountable to the Congo, even though the United States is very much responsible for things that have been going on in the Congo for decades. So that's part of the problem with neocolonialism, that officially there's no responsibility, even in the context of Guyana. I mean, I would imagine the average American citizen can't tell you about the politics in Guyana, but most Guyanese would understand that a good portion of the struggles that Guyanese continue to face with their politics is due to the CIA's meddling in Guyanese politics in the 60s. It created an atmosphere in Guyanese politics that the country has still never recovered from. So that's neocolonialism. It's a situation where the former colonial powers are able to still have that level of impact within those countries, but within a way where there's no official representation. There's no an official type of channel to go through in terms of how do these people in these colonies really express these grievances, because you're not under the jurisdiction of the colonial power anymore. The colonial power doesn't owe you an explanation for anything that they're doing. And the situation with colonialism, it did kind of create a relationship where the colonial power was to some degree responsible for the things that were going on in the colonies, because ultimately they still had control over the colonies. But the other reality about neocolonialism that makes it very difficult to address as well, and this is where Walter Rodney's analysis becomes important, is that during the colonial period, there was a very clear demarcation in terms of, these are the white European colonial masters. These are the people oppressing you. Now, within the neocolonial system, it's not always apparent who the oppressor is, because you do have, as I pointed out, the Western nations that are responsible, but you also have a class of African leaders that are complicit in the exploitation. And where that becomes very tricky is that very often the neocolonial leaders that are oppressing the masses of people will never come out right and say, hey, I'm a neocolonial leader. I represent, British imperialism. I represent American imperialism. As Walter Rodney pointed out, and this is a contradiction we still deal with to this day, very often the neocolonial leaders will come before the masses of the people and say, hey, I'm an African just like you. I'm a Pan-Africanist. I'm a Black nationalist. I'm an anti-imperialist. They push that type of those type of ideologies, and it creates a lot of confusion in terms of, well, who's who in Africa, who's who in the Caribbean. Then if somebody like Eric Williams, for example, was this very prominent anti-colonial leader, gave a very famous speech titled Master They Done, which he was essentially proclaiming the end of British imperialism in Trinidad. If this individual is the same guy who's banning Kwame Ture from Trinidad, it creates that question of, well, who really is the true anti-imperialist in this situation? Is it Kwame Ture, or is it the guy who was denouncing British imperialism? So those are some of the contradictions that Walter Rodney was forced to wrestle with in neocolonial society. And ultimately, when he goes to Guyana, it's the same situation in Guyana. And unfortunately, there's still that division within the Pan-African community in Guyana. There's still that division between the Walter Rodney camp of Pan-African radicalism and the Forbes Burnham camp of Pan-African radicalism, because Burnham, even though he was more or less put in power by the CIA in Guyana, when he came into power, Burnham proclaimed to be a socialist, proclaimed to be anti-imperialist, was actually very supportive of liberation struggles in Africa. So outwardly, Burnham appeared to be a very revolutionary socialist Pan-African type of figure. But when Walter Rodney came back to Guyana, that's where the confrontation came about, because from Walter Rodney's perspective, Burnham really wasn't as socialist as he proclaimed himself to be, because he was still, taking loans from the World Bank, still taking loans from the IMF, engaging in structural readjustment programs that put the burden of the readjustment on the masses of the people. So Burnham saw those Walter Rodney saw those contradictions with Burnham's professed ideologies and public statements and the actual policies that were being implemented by the PNC. So that's where neocolonialism becomes a very tricky situation, because as Walter Rodney pointed out, we really have to figure out who is who in the struggles for liberation of African people, because as I pointed out, typically the people who are the neocolonial elites will never actually admit that they're neocolonials who represent the interest of foreign powers. They try to present themselves as being Pan-Africanist and being anti-imperial.
Yeah.
It would be helpful if they would just do that, though. If they would just.
Nope. Got to make it hard, It reminds me of Kwame Ture and Black Power calling it a system of indirect rule. I've heard flag independence as another term for it, but yeah, it sounds very complex. And it sounds like why Rodney's analysis, his Marxist analysis of understanding class was so important. And then, I mentioned Kwame Ture, you mentioned Nkrumah's neocolonialism, the last stage of imperialism. So all of these thinkers across the diaspora being in conversation with each other is really interesting to understand this phenomenon. So I think that transitioned us perfectly into the next chapter, Race and Class, Marxism and Pan-Africanism. We discussed the importance of learning from different revolutionary contexts and studying revolutionary struggles globally and historically. What did Rodney learn from Amilcar Cabral regarding Marxism and Pan-Africanism? And what other revolutionary leaders and thinkers shaped Rodney's development?
So this particular chapter, I would say, was probably the most fun in terms of writing, because it really gets to the points that were raised before about the question of how relevant is Marxism and Marxist ideas to the African struggle. And this was something that was really being heavily debated. When we think about the 60s and the 70s and what was going on within the Pan-African struggle at that time. And there was one camp that said, we're not going to worship, Marx, as Sada Shakur pointed out. It's not a situation where we're idolizing Karl Marx, but we're recognizing the importance of his theories and, the applicability of these theories to the material conditions of our struggle. So that was one camp within the Pan-African movement. There was another camp that was more of a cultural nationalist type of approach that said, we don't want anything to do with anything foreign, anything non-African. We don't want anything to do with Karl Marx, because Karl Marx was, a European. What was interesting about Walter Rodney is he seemed to have found himself in the middle of those two conflicting camps, where Walter Rodney, in a lot of ways, understood the importance of affirming African identity, affirming Africa's culture and the cultural identity of African people, but at the same time incorporating a Marxist analysis in doing it, and at the same time also incorporating a very what I would say a Black nationalistic type of critique of the white working class, because a part of why the secondary camp that I mentioned was also skeptical of Marxism is this idea of working class unity. They didn't see the white working class, particularly in America, as being viable allies in fighting capitalism. And I mentioned in the book Bobby Wright, he was a psychologist. That was why he dismissed communism. He said, any movement that requires us to unite with the white working class, it's not going to happen. And interestingly, Walter Rodney seemed to share a similar view, at least where the white working class in America was concerned. That was Walter Rodney's view. He described the white working class as being an imperialistic working class. So Walter Rodney's views on this issue is very, very fascinating for that reason, because as I said, as these two camps are having conflicting views on the relevance of Marxism in the Pan-African struggle, Walter Rodney seems to have no problem adopting Marxist positions, but also adopting Black nationalistic positions as well. And I would argue part of that is because of his influences. You mentioned Amilcar Cabral, and why Cabral was a very important influence for Walter Rodney is that Cabral, when you look at his theoretical approach to the African liberation struggle, was able to take Karl Marx's method of analysis and apply it to African society, particularly Guinea-Bissau. And why this is important is because, Walter Rodney made this point, and Kwame Ture also made this point as well about socialism, that even though, Karl Marx is a white man writing about the material conditions of Europe, his method of analysis is something that could be applied to any society, not necessarily European society. And when you take that method of analysis and apply it to African society, the conclusions might not necessarily be the same, but the method of analysis is still has a level of validity, even though the conclusions are different. So Amilcar Cabral took that theory, took that methodological approach to studying society and applied it to Guinea-Bissau. And what he recognized is that even though class formation in Guinea-Bissau was very different than in European society, in Cabral's writings, he mentions how Guinea-Bissau had what he called vertical structures as well as horizontal structures. And the horizontal structures were societies that were more or less classless societies or chiefless societies. You didn't have classes above classes in the horizontal societies. So Cabral is pointing out that even though Guinea-Bissau's material development might not necessarily be the same as Europe's in terms of class structures, societal structures, that the method of analysis is still applicable, particularly during the period of history that Cabral was engaged in, and Walter Rodney made this point as well, that even though African societies did not go through the same historical development as Europe in terms of reaching a stage of capitalism, colonialism brought capitalism to Africa and imposed a capitalistic system on African people. So now we need a particular anti-capitalistic methodology and a level of analysis to really confront colonialism, because colonialism is tied up with capitalism. So that was Cabral's approach, that even though African people did not develop capitalism within our own society, we still do need to understand capitalism, and we still need to have a valid critique of capitalism. So for that
message,
Yes.
I'm sorry.
Had to be there.
that's fine.
Just keep going. I didn't mean to cut you off. Keep going.
That's fine. So, so for that reason, Cabral and that generation of African leaders recognized that they needed to develop that critique of capitalism, and that made Karl Marx and everything that Karl Marx was writing about capitalism relevant to the African revolutionary struggle. So that was more or less why Cabral became an important influence on Walter Rodney, because Cabral demonstrated that you could take that methodology, you could take that approach to studying history and historical development, and even though it's something that Karl Marx created within the context of Europe, you could still take that methodological approach and apply it to a non-European society, and Cabral offered a model of how to apply it to African society.
Can I just, I didn't even want to say this while we were talking before the show started. I wanted to wait till we were live on air, so to speak, because I really want to salute you for what you did in this section. I loved this chapter, in particular because, and tell me if I'm wrong on this, and I may be projecting my own hopes and dreams, but it seems like you wrote this almost saying to your audience, African people, please get over some of these ridiculous, settle your quarrels. You talked about how Rodney, wrote in praise of George Jackson, and it's like I'm reading this, and you're reminding us, hey, what Rodney's often put in the Marxist camp, but he had a very race first analysis. Then you quickly jump over to Garvey and say Garvey's often reduced only to a race first approach or race only approach. And you said, but he had actually a class analysis where he even at one point advocated, suggested that, African working people got to team up with the white working people to get these rich working people out of rich people out of here, right? Rich white people out of here. So, and you do it all in a relatively short but clearly written section. And I was like, this chapter is so I just wanted to salute you for that, because I did you have that in mind as you wrote? Do you have that in mind at all, this idea I want us to get over some of these beefs between the variations of nationalists and materialists?
Actually, I did have that in mind, because prior to writing that chapter, I mean, even years before, this goes back to just being a student in college and really understanding different theoretical approaches, different ideological approaches to Pan-Africanism. It was something that I kept encountering, and that's why I mentioned the two conflicting camps. This camp that says it's a race struggle, and this camp that says it's a class struggle. So as I was studying Walter Rodney, I realized Walter Rodney was somebody that was able to balance those two perspectives. And I deliberately mentioned Marcus Garvey in there because, when we talk about influences on Walter Rodney, and even in Walter Rodney's own speeches and writings, we think of Cabral, C.L.R. James, Francis Fanon, people who actually were Marxist. But it's interesting that Garvey actually was a big influence on Walter Rodney as well, to the point that in the Groundings with My Brothers, Walter Rodney actually refers to Garvey as being the greatest spokesperson that the Black Power movement had produced. And it might seem strange that, Rodney being a Marxist would have such praise of Garvey, particularly when we see the average opinion of Garvey that socialists and Marxists have is not a particularly positive opinion. And I think part of it is because Garvey gets reduced to being a race first figure with no class analysis. So I particularly wanted to include Garvey to show that even though Garvey was race first, Garvey actually did have a particular class analysis. And what was fascinating about Garvey, that Garvey was a self-professed capitalist, but he also had critiques of the capitalistic system. For example, I did write a book on Garvey, and I pointed out that, in Garvey's vision of capitalism, he envisioned state intervention in capitalism, so that Garvey even understood that you can't have capitalism unchecked, because, it's going to be not only destructive.
He was Keynesian.
Yeah,
I'm just playing. I'm just playing. That was a bad joke. Please, everybody, ease up.
He'll kill you in the comments. Watch. Oh man.
Sometimes I just see a joke sitting there. I can't help it. It's all good. I'm here for the.
Well, I was
going
to jump in. First off, I'm glad Jared gave you your flowers because you cooked. You cooked in this chapter. It was well done. And then Jared got to what I was hinting at because one of my comrades and I, we were very excited because we didn't know that Rodney had tried to coordinate with George Jackson. And you very much talk about Rodney having ties to the Panthers, having ties to the Institute of the Black World, all sorts of different places. Yeah. So that was really fantastic. To the Garvey point and to this show's title, I wanted to shout out a working class scholar, RIP Dr. Jeffrey Perry. And the person he studied was Henry Hubert Harrison, a Black atheist socialist who was a close comrade of, and I would say, someone who was pulling Garvey to the left. So I think that's really important to mention as well, that Garvey had one of the foremost African socialist thinkers in his camp. And Harrison left the white socialists and white communists because he was like, y'all don't have shit for us on race. So he was frustrated. So he was already reaching a lot of these conclusions. I look at him, I look at Claudia Jones. I just think it's really fascinating. The people who were seen as race first or nationalists, and that they are actually having a dialectical materialist view of history, society, and merging Marxism and Pan-Africanism in that way. So I wanted to shout that out. If you wanted to speak real quickly on the George Jackson connection, I'd appreciate it. And then speaking of another scholar who influenced Rodney, we can jump to the next question. But,
the George Jackson point was interesting. Walter Rodney actually wrote a short essay on George Jackson after Jackson was killed. And Walter Rodney's analysis on George Jackson was interesting because, as Walter Rodney pointed out, and I mentioned it in the book, is that prison typically is not the place that you would think of when you think of engaging in a revolutionary struggle. But he pointed out that George Jackson was not only able to organize that, but he pointed out the importance of the fact that George Jackson, like Malcolm X, was actually engaged in the process of educating himself in prison, engaged in the process of really understanding what was going on. And again, to go back to the point of, you could take Marxist analysis and apply it to a non-European situation, and the conclusion might not necessarily be the same. And Walter Rodney's point about George Jackson, I think, is really where we see this with Walter Rodney and his approach to Marxism, and where we see that Walter Rodney was not somebody who's very dogmatic about Marxism, meaning that if Karl Marx said this, Walter Rodney wasn't just going to go along with it because it was an opinion or a conclusion that Karl Marx had. And so, to get back to George Jackson, Walter Rodney made the point that the lumpen proletariat that Karl Marx was very critical of, very dismissive of, Walter Rodney held the view that George Jackson's rebellion in prison demonstrated that among African people, the lumpen proletariat actually could be a potential revolutionary force, and it's from that particular class that revolutionary figures like a George Jackson, like a Malcolm X, emerged. Now, that was not Karl Marx's particular view on the lumpen proletariat, but that was Walter Rodney's view. That was the view of the Black Panther Party as well. So George Jackson would be a great example of the fact that, even though Walter Rodney was applying Karl Marx's method of analysis, as I pointed out, the conclusions were different. And the conclusion in this case was that the lumpen proletariat actually could produce individuals who were very revolutionary, such as a George Jackson.
Yeah. And he applied the method to his society and conditions, which is what we talked about before. Like, it's not going to look the same as 19th century industrial Europe, which I think is really important. I had one more point, and then we'll get into this last question. About the method, why it's frustrating. Another great white working scholar, but Parenti has a joke that I want to say because I thought of this joke, but he's like, this Marx guy keeps stealing all my ideas. And he's talking about how he would say shit and people would be like, that's Marx. So I literally was in school and I was like, why isn't this? And they were like, oh, you sound like Karl Marx. So what's super frustrating about all of this is I'm like, if this is a method, if this is scientific, any human could have come up with this. In fact, most of us probably already did in different pieces and components. We just didn't have decades scholarship, supporting wife, comrade like Ingalls, all these things.
I was going to say somebody bankrolling you to write. Yeah, I mean, yeah.
Like, hey, reproduce that shit with shingles. Again, speaking of a good dude who made a good contribution. So the last question, we talked about George Jackson. We talked about Amilcar Cabral, Kwame Nkrumah. After Rodney's assassination, this is the last chapter, Rodney and the Working People's Alliance. I guess, first off, we should highlight that. We haven't said that yet. Could you speak briefly about Walter Rodney's assassination for folks who are just now being exposed to Walter Rodney for the first time?
Yeah, so that situation was to give some historical background as to what's happening in Walter Rodney's life at this time. He, after being banned from Jamaica, he went back to Tanzania and continued teaching at Tanzania. So after some time, Walter Rodney decides to return to Guyana to teach at the University of Guyana, and the government there decides that they don't want a radical figure like Walter Rodney teaching at the university. And again, the contradictions I'm talking about. Burnham is supposed to be a Pan-Africanist who's fighting imperialism, sending aid to the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa and these different liberation struggles across Africa. You would think somebody like this would want Walter Rodney teaching at the university, but he decides that he doesn't want Walter Rodney teaching there. So, Walter Rodney's furthest real conflict with Burnham's government is actually the fact that Burnham's government denied him a teaching position at UG, the University of Guyana. So Walter Rodney comes back to Guyana. He joins the Working People's Alliance. Now, some background on the Working People's Alliance. The Working People's Alliance was essentially a fusion of different organizations that had already been working independently. These organizations were in conflict with Burnham's government, and they decided to form what eventually became a political party, the WPA, to combat Burnham's dictatorship. But what was particularly important about the WPA at this time, the name is very intentional, Working People's Alliance, because you had the PNC, Burnham's political party, which was seen as an African party, and the PPP, Chedi Jagan's political party, which was seen as an Indian party. So the WPA presented itself as a party that represents the working people of Guyana. It's not an African party, it's not an Indian party or an Amerindian party. It represents the interest of the working people of Guyana. So when Walter Rodney returns to Guyana, he joins the WPA and becomes one of the members of the WPA, and becomes involved in the conflict against Burnham's government. And subsequently, that's what led to his assassination. Burnham's government, as many dictatorships do, started resorting to violence to suppress opposition. So in the case of Walter Rodney, and I detail the assassination in the book, that Walter Rodney was trying to secure a walkie-talkie for communication, and the walkie-talkie turned out to be a bomb, and that ultimately is what led to his assassination.
And speaking of the neocolonialism, I know that we talk about the government, the Burnham regime, but there were Western forces involved. Am I correct? Or we're trying...
Yeah, that's correct. Because and again, I made the point before that what happened, and again to give some historical context to everything that's happening, Burnham came to power in Guyana because of the support of the CIA. Because I mentioned before, the PPP and Jagan were Marxist, particularly Marxist-Leninists, so they had very close connections to. And Britain decided that they were going to allow Guyana to become independent, but Guyana could not be independent with a Marxist government. So they intervened in Guyana, essentially tried to divide the anti-colonial struggle. And this is an important point as well, that the original PPP was actually a multiracial political party, and Burnham himself was a member of the PPP. So Burnham leaving the PPP created this split in African politics between Africans and Indians, but the original PPP was a multiracial party. So the Western powers intervene in Guyana to support Burnham and to help Burnham into power. And once Burnham comes into power, then Burnham kind of switches on the Western powers, and he declares that he's a socialist, and he establishes connections with Cuba. And even though, as I said, outwardly he's portraying himself as being a socialist, the Western powers really don't take any action against Burnham, because they still prefer having Burnham in power than Jagan, particularly because, as I pointed out, Burnham is still making certain concessions to the Western powers, still taking loans from the IMF, still taking loans from the World Bank. So Burnham is seen as a figure who the United States is, they're uncomfortable with Burnham and with his ideology, but they still see him as being more tolerable, or they prefer him rather than Jagan, because Jagan is a Marxist-Leninist with actual ties to the Soviet Union, and they see Jagan as somebody who wouldn't be as easy to control as Burnham was, even though Burnham was taking these anti-imperialistic positions. So there definitely was a lot of foreign intervention in what was going on in the politics of Guyana at the time. And something that actually was very fascinating to me the first time I read Malcolm X Speaks, and mind you, I was 16, a student in high school, was that Malcolm X actually had an assessment of what was going on in Guyana at the time. That Malcolm X was aware of the foreign intervention in terms of creating that racial division in Guyana, and that's something that Malcolm X had actually mentioned. So yeah, I remember that, being a 16-year-old Guyanese reading Malcolm X speaks and being surprised that Malcolm X is talking about my country. He's got analysis of what's happening in Guyana.
And for our ADOS folks, Malcolm's mom is from where? Grenada. Would you like that? How'd that happen? No way. Okay. So speaking of this last point, so thank you for outlining the assassination. He received a radio. I believe his brother was in the car as well.
Yeah. Yep.
And so Walter Rodney was killed by the explosion. His brother was severely injured as well. And his family is still seeking justice. They are still making wins in stopping the Guyanese government from covering it up. So if you look at the Walter Rodney Foundation, which we'll mention a little bit later, you can see some updates on that for folks in the audience. For this last point. So after Rodney's assassination, one of his mentors, maybe I'm mistaken a mentor, but at least intellectually, CLR James
was a mentor, yes.
It was? Okay, cool. Just checking. One of his mentors, CLR James, critiqued Rodney's revolutionary activity, suggesting he was organizing in places he shouldn't have been as a scholar. Can you outline the flaws in this critique and why it contradicts Rodney's revolutionary praxis?
And you show how it contradicts CLR James' own critique of Nkrumah.
No.
That's pretty slick, yeah.
He didn't even have his facts straight, but let's go ahead, please. Get into
it. Yeah, so the thing about that critique, and I think again, we need to be very careful, because when we talk about, Marxism, and not just Marxism, any theory, we need to be careful about not becoming so theoretical that we're not working among the masses of people. We're not applying these things to the actual conditions of, because ultimately that's what we're talking about. When we're talking about the material conditions of the people, these ideas actually need to be applied to the material conditions of the people. So, and I made the point too that Walter Rodney never saw himself as being a leader. So within the Working People's Alliance, and this is actually something that even a lot of Guyanese aren't aware of. I've had to correct people on this. Walter Rodney was never the leader of the Working People's Alliance. The WPA never actually had a singular leader. So I think part of the issue with CLR James's critique is he's looking at Walter Rodney as Walter Rodney is the leader of the movement, and he should never be putting the leader in a vulnerable position like that. But within the movement itself, Walter Rodney did not see himself as leader, and he was not seen as the leader of the movement. And I quoted David Hines, who made the point that what was so appealing to Walter Rodney is that he was out there with the masses of the people, and it sent a signal that Walter Rodney did not view himself as being more important than the people in the movement, that Walter Rodney wasn't going to put other people in danger if he wasn't going to put himself in the same danger. So Walter Rodney was always on the front lines of the movement. So that's how Walter Rodney saw the work that he was doing, not only in Guyana, but wherever he was. He felt that it was important to really connect with the masses and to be of the masses, not to be a leader of the masses, but to be of the masses and to be struggling alongside the masses. So I think, CLR James's critique, I don't think was a particularly effective critique in that way, because he really didn't seem to appreciate the work that Walter Rodney was doing. And I don't mention it in this book about Walter Rodney, but a critique I've had of CLR James is that CLR James actually was involved in politics in Trinidad. He did try to combat Eric Williams' government, and he wasn't particularly successful because CLR James never had the mass following that Walter Rodney had. And this is even a point I make when CLR James critiques Marcus Garvey, that James has his particular critique of Garvey, but James does not have the mass following that Garvey has. And I think part of it is James really struggled to connect with the masses, because for him Marxism was more so theoretical than actually being a type of a practice where you actually engage with the masses and you organize among the masses. So he was a great Marxist theoretician. That's why I made the point that he actually was a mentor of Walter Rodney as well, that he was a very significant influence on Walter Rodney. But one of the areas where the two of them really differed was Walter Rodney's understanding of Marxism was that this needs to be something that's actually connected to the struggles of the masses, whereas CLR James's approach tended to be more theoretical. And I made the point there as well, and this actually came up during the Commission of Inquiry, the Commission of Inquiry that was done into Walter Rodney's assassination, that CLR James actually did not have all of his facts in terms of really understanding what was going on in Guyana. And I did want to include the point about Nkrumah as well, because I thought it was kind of interesting that his critique of Nkrumah was Nkrumah waited too long for revolution in Ghana, but he also wanted Walter Rodney to wait for revolution.
Sounds like I literally have, sounds like armchair revolutionary.
Yeah,
notes here. That is interesting. I wanted to point out the fact that he had incorrect, because again, he's not aware of the facts on the ground. So he thought that Rodney was chilling with an agent of Burnham's government,
Yes.
correct?
Yeah.
So he
That's what
didn't
he
know
thought.
that Rodney was with his brother. So that
Yeah.
was, I think, something that should be pointed out. And I just wanted to close with David Hines's quote, because you put it in here. I think it's amazing. David Hines explained, had he delegated to me, then you're saying that my life is not worth as much as Rodney's life. That was not the Rodney way. Rodney was what the Rastafarians called a forwarder. When you were out there, he was out there with you. And I put Ella Baker by that as well, because that's the tradition I also see it as. So I really appreciated that. Y'all, fantastic book. Please get this book. Political and Intellectual Legacy of Walter Rodney. Fantastic read, 90 pages. Check it out. And thank you, Brother Omowale. I know our time is coming to a close, but I did have one more kind of question that I wanted to touch on, and we'll build on that in the future. If you could pull the slides back up, Jared, we can get into it and ride out. So specifically, you talk about Hill, and you mentioned this quote a little bit earlier, so I want to bring us back to it. Hill described Rodney, next slide. Hill described Rodney's Pan-Africanism as follows. As in everything that he thought and wrote, Walter based his viewpoint of Pan-Africanism first and foremost on a rigorous delineation of the facets of class structure and class struggle that underlay the earlier anti-colonial struggles and the distorted social formations that succeeded to formal independence. He steadfastly refused to romanticize African society. So I want to focus on that point, the romanticizing African society. In Rodney's thinking, there was no break between Marxism and Pan-Africanism because for Rodney, the two ideologies complemented each other. This was especially important given the neocolonial context which Rodney operated in. So today we've been talking about Rodney's method, his history, his background. And one thing I really want to hone in on, again, is his approach to Black/African history. And that particular point about refusing to romanticize African society. Could you say a little bit more on that? I know you did earlier, but I want to bring it back at this point. What does it mean to not romanticize African society?
Well, I'll give a particular example that I write about in the book. That when Walter Rodney talks about the period of the slave trade, he's actually very open about the fact that there was a particular the ruling class of African society. There were particular kings, chiefs, particular people who were actually engaged in the slave trade because they profited from engaging in it. So that's the point they made before, that if we're creating this romantic utopian Africa, it creates an African history that not only did not exist, but you're creating an African history that's free of those type of contradictions. And not only is that a problem in terms of it skews the conditions of our people, it skews why we're in the circumstance, because when you create this utopian Africa, the obvious question is, well, what went wrong? How were we able to be conquered in the way that we conquered if we had essentially Wakanda? If we had Wakanda, how did Wakanda get conquered? But why this was also important for Walter Rodney, this wasn't just a historical question. I made the point before that when we talk about neocolonialism, there are certain neocolonial leaders who present themselves as being very pro-African. And why it's important to get the history correct here is because, and I mentioned this in the book, that one of the things that Walter Rodney was combating was this the ideology of African socialism. And this African socialism was based on this utopian Africa. It's based on this idea that Africa prior to European colonialism was just this classless society, this classless utopian society that did not have strict hierarchies, did not have forms of human exploitation. So the problem in creating this type of classless Africa is the African socialists then just declared that we're African socialists and we're practicing traditional African culture. And that's it. There's no broader critique of capitalism. There's no attempt to restructure African societies in a way that really puts the masses of the people in power, that puts the working class in power. It just becomes an exercise in creating this idyllic African past. It becomes an exercise in romanticizing African history and culture, but there's no attempt to really restructure the existing society, because what they're trying to do is to recapture fictitious classless African society. And that is one critique I've had of Julius Nyerere's particular approach to African socialism, because he was an African socialist as well, that his theory of Ujamaa, he specifically said that class warfare was something that was found in European society, and he rejected the class analysis of Marxism. He didn't feel like it was applicable to Africa's situation. But as I point out in the book, Walter Rodney demonstrated that even in Tanzania under Julius Nyerere, there were class contradictions in which workers didn't control the factories. You know, there were bosses that controlled the factories, and when the workers tried to take control and take over the factory, the police came in and essentially restored control of the factory. So that there were class contradictions even in Tanzanian society, as Julius Nyerere is declaring that class warfare is European and it's not applicable to Africa. So this is why it was important for Walter Rodney to really have that approach of African history, because he recognized that certain people were actually distorting African history as a means to secure their own positions as neocolonial exploiters of African people. Because if your understanding of African history is that African societies were classless and that class conflicts and class warfare and class contradictions are completely alien to Africa, how do you go about addressing existing class issues within African societies if we were coming from a position that all of this is just irrelevant and it's not applicable to Africa in any way? So this wasn't the situation of getting the historical record correct. This was a situation of understanding how particular interpretations of history actually shape contemporary politics.
And I would add that, I mean, even your interpretation, I would say that's a more radical, left-leaning idealization of Black history, you know, that we might see in some cultural nationalist types. But the type I was exposed to, and I think this is the crisis of Black History Month as it's been commercialized in the US, is not even that we were classless, it's that we were kings and queens, right? That whole discussion that we were emperors and rulers, and how's everybody a king and queen who's working? Yeah. So this is how I've seen it. I see obsessions with Egypt on our people, so many tattoos, oh my goodness. Yeah. Obsessions with Mansa Musa. So obsessions with rulers, kings, states. And I actually really love that Walter Rodney points out that the majority of Africans did not live in state, like these big political states, right? They lived in stateless societies, or they had different forms of social organization. So I really appreciated you pointing that in that book, and then why that is relevant to us today. Because I'm not even running into people who think Africa was a utopia where there was no class. I'm running into people who think that Africa was a utopia where we were all rich and treated.
That's a great point.
How come nobody has tattoos of the somebody bagging groceries, chopping wood? You know what I'm saying? Like, you know what I'm saying?
Nope, it's always a pharaoh
harvesting the crops.
No, but that's a great point, and it goes back to what I was saying, how particular interpretations of history actually shape contemporary politics. So the reason why I made the point about the classless societies, that was a particular ideology being promoted by the African socialists in Africa. You know, the African leaders who essentially didn't want to change class structures in Africa, so just said, well, you know, class conflict, it has nothing to do with African people anyway, so we're just not going to address the class issue. Now, what you're talking about is more so the approach that we find in the diaspora, where people use history as kind of an ego massaging type of thing, that we feel good about ourselves when we look at our history, and our history isn't just slavery. It's Mansa Musa, it's pharaohs, it's kings and queens. So that's a different type of political approach. But as you two pointed out, the question of, if we were all kings and queens, well, how does a society work where there's only kings and queens if there's no peasants to work for the kings and queens?
Yes. And then when I look at the stories of the peasants, like one of the first worker strikes in history is in Egypt. So I'm like, I'm on the Pharaoh side. This is, you know, even in our own biblical history, which is the historical confusion where we study the Bible as history, the discussion is Pharaoh is the ruler and Moses is trying to free the people. And even so, this is these are two Africans, at least as we understand. So I think that's really interesting. To transition to the next slide, I wanted to discuss why this form of thinking is dangerous and how it's having implications for our movements today. So, Jared, I'm going through the archives.
Oh, wow. Yeah, wow.
Yeah, you did decolonize the dialectic. So we have another example that I could pull from when discussing what dialectics are. And I highly recommend that. I'll probably visit that on this show at some point. But this was a comment that I really wanted to address.
I was looking. Yeah, sorry.
No, go ahead. I'm sure you were, just like me.
Wrote a paper on Frantz Fanon, one of my absolute heroes. I believe I've read everything on Fanon, collect everything Fanon, but he seems to have been forgotten. Thanks for mentioning his name. Many people don't even know who he is, may not know who he is. Neely Fuller taught us that there's no such thing as colonialism, socialism, apartheid, capitalism, democracy. There is only white supremacy. It is only the only government on the planet. However, Dr. Welsing diagnosed the cause of white supremacy as being the white man's fear of genetic annihilation due to the dominance of black genes. Therefore, I believe that the most powerful and awesome force on this planet is the black man. Interesting. I don't even know. I don't know Neely Fuller's work that well. We only interviewed him a couple of times. I don't remember him making that particular form of his argument, but that's interesting.
Right. Yeah. But I do think there's probably some sort of implication there. I'm seeing the intellectual genealogy when I see Chris Welsing in there. I know you get into this, so I'm very excited to close out on this point. But how things are explained. I saw Bobby Wright mentioned in the book, funny enough, because Rodney's critiquing the anti-communism of Bobby Wright. He also critiques Kwame Ture's earlier, more idealist conception of Black power, because he says when he came to Guyana, was it that it was an issue, right? Because he was actually limiting the work of
U.S. politics,
and Indians, which is very interesting. So this understanding of how we're oppressed, why we came to be oppressed. And as you mentioned, like a certain ego massaging, but the most powerful and awesome force on the planet. I want to be clear. This person did not say black people.
Black man.
This person did not say black woman. This person said the black man. So getting into this sort of analysis of our situation, Rodney's method, in my estimation, and the video talked about this, incorporating understandings of science and discoveries like that. So understanding how evolution and DNA changed our understanding of things. With Rodney's explanation of the world, it feels like I could get from scratch to where we are now. I can understand that we're human primates that have been distributed across the world, and different histories and conditions result in why we're different. And that makes sense to me scientifically. However, we have a lot of people who explain our oppression to things like fear of genetic annihilation, skin color envy, our melanin giving us certain special abilities. So I really wanted to get into Rodney's take on this. And if we get into the next slide real quick, Jared. These are two books, one of which I think you've done a great takedown of, Brother Omowale, but that I think are very relevant to this discussion. The Iceman Inheritance, Prehistoric Sources of Western Man's Racism, Sexism, and Aggression, and They Came Before Columbus by Ivan Van Sertima. For folks who aren't kind of familiar with this, they really are. Most people are familiar through the community because this has been spreading like wildfire. But can you outline kind of the general theme of these books, particularly They Came Before Columbus, because that's one I've been running into in community all the time.
So yeah, I'll actually start by saying I've never read The Iceman Inheritance. So what I know of the book are comments and statements I've seen by people who have.
Oh, it's fascinating.
Book. So yeah, I've not read it myself, so I really can't speak too much to
Ice Age. I'm just gonna say this: the Ice Age was 11,000 years ago. Just like that's a very long time.
The very short thesis of it is that the Caucasus Mountains produced the most aggressive form of whiteness, and that group, that most aggressive form of whiteness, are currently the European Jews who have usurped the history of Hebrews and imposed themselves. And it claims to have scientific evidence that shows this heightened aggression in the form of I don't know, is it Neanderthal, wherever the stage of evolution,
like wait, just
Neanderthal, so it's and I read it because I was doing my thesis on Dr. Clark. He wrote the foreword of a reprint, so I
know you know this. Go ahead, please. If you can focus on maybe They Came Before Columbus, the argument.
So now actually I have read They Came Before Columbus, and this one is fascinating to me because I think a lot of people who claiming that Black people are indigenous to America and the slave trade never happened, we were already here. I think why it's fascinating to me is I have a lot of critiques of the book, particularly Ivan Van Sertima's methodology to how he approached doing the book. But what I find is a lot of people who use the book to support those type of claims have never actually read the book, because Van Sertima's argument is not that Black people are indigenous to America and that we were already here. And even based on the logic of the book.
And he certainly never denied the trade in enslaved Africans. No. So yeah, I'm sorry to cut you off. Yeah.
No, that's a major difference, Jared.
Is that what people are saying? Wait a minute, I didn't even know this. Are people using his book to say that slavery didn't happen?
Slave trade never happened because black people.
In fact, he details in the book how Africans leaving Egypt created a boat. He even talked about how they modern day sailors recreated the boats just as the ancient Egyptians did, and showed how the tides naturally take you over to the southern United States. So his point was just that. And he used the what was found in undigested materials and mummies and stuff to show tobacco that would have been brought over from here to show an exchange. So his argument was that there was an exchange and that the Africans were engaged with the people here before Columbus, before enslavement, not as a replacement of. And then he even shows how using old Arab trade routes, like the world was already globalized despite the modern claim to the term. So that I've never heard anybody actually. I'm sorry, that's very new and disturbing to me to hear.
Yeah, you definitely be aware how the myth lives in the community and how the scholarship bleeds into the working people. Because again, to Rodney's point, he was in the field actually teaching us our history, working on that kind of thing. This. I'm not trying to talk about his background because I think he also did community lectures and all that. I'm just saying this is how this gets absorbed and then spat back out very often. But even that,
in fact, I brought him to Frostburg. He spoke what would have been the precursor to a Mama's Biscuits show. So just to draw those parallels. Yeah. So yeah, he was. But yeah.
But to some of the points you were making, some of these citations, Brother Omowale, did you have some analysis of that evidence in the argument here?
What Van Sertima?
Yeah.
Are we talking about his claims or the other?
We can do both. We can, because they're I think mixed. I think they fuse
nice. Like I said, just to start with those other claims. Like I said, just to me, it's a problem where people are using Van Sertima's work and to support claims that Van Sertima certainly would have not supported. But to get to that book, my particular critique is I think Van Sertima just draws a lot of conclusions based on lack of evidence. So, for example, in this book, he actually makes the argument that Egyptian rulers from the 25th dynasty, he particularly picked the 25th dynasty because that was the Nubian controlled dynasty of Egypt. And it's kind of arbitrary. There really wasn't any reason to pick that dynasty because in later books, he actually has to revise that theory based, to update the timeline. But he picks that dynasty and he says, those Egyptians sailed to the Americas and helped to influence the Olmec culture. And there's not a shred of historical evidence to support any of this. But when he's writing it, he's not writing it from the standpoint of he's speculating about history. He's actually writing it as if he's writing real history. And particularly the second claim with Abu Bakr II, based on historical evidence, we do know that he attempted to sail the Atlantic Ocean. Now, he never actually returned home, so nobody knows what happened to him. But Van Sertima doesn't write it as a situation where it's possible that he could have arrived in the Americas, although maybe unlikely. He actually gives a very vivid description of what it would have looked like for those African boats to arrive in the Americas. And again, he's writing a very vivid description as if he's writing historical fact. In reality, we don't know what happened to this particular individual. So, that's my main critique of the book, that he's engaging in very speculative history, which I don't necessarily have a problem with, but the problem that I have with his approach is that he's not writing it as if it's speculative. He's actually writing it as this is real historical fact. He's writing it as if these are things that are supported by historical documentation. And the reality is there's no historical documentation to support the idea, but particularly the 25th dynasty, there's no historical documentation to support the idea that any Egyptian dynasty would have undertaken that voyage to the Americas and that Abu Bakr actually would have successfully arrived in the Americas.
Yeah, and I just want to highlight, because you're asking, because we talked about this deep psychological need we have to correct white supremacists in Eurocentric history, and that's very important. I think that's the core of Rodney's understanding of Black history and why it's necessary. But I think you're pointing out certain key idealistic, utopian kind of things that drew Van Sertima to these conclusions. First off, I point out we came from West and Central Africa, yet there's this obsession with Egypt. So that'd be the first point. Second point is what you said. He picks the 25th dynasty because that's the indisputably black dynasty, right? But we could talk about Egypt, and how Rodney describes them is that they were lighter and red-skinned Africans, and they were definitely influenced and married to the society to the south in Sudan, which were more dark-skinned Africans. And so I think that's really important. But to the point about the travel, again, when I've talked to brothers about this, because it's usually brothers who believe this, so not exclusively, I'll be like, okay, let's say he did make it over here. Like you said, Van Sertima makes it seem like it was like this thing that happened. This was a historical event, like he's describing it in space and time. The reason I'm struggling is because of what you mentioned earlier with Guyana, what we experience here, this issue with African and Native solidarity and what that looks like, and how if we're confused about our histories, we don't get there. So I find this book very anti-indigenous. And I think that, first off, I don't want to pathologize Van Sertima. I think this is what we said before about Clark. Like, he's dealing with an entire field of people who have poisoned scholarship, to be real. And so one person who breaks down this book points out that other people had said the Chinese had done this to Olmec society, or the Polynesians. So Van Sertima is taking from his peers in this cultural diffusionism theory, as far as I understand it. And that's how come he's saying that, oh, you see the face of the book. That's an African face there, right? That's what he's saying. He's basically saying that the red people, the native people who lived there, couldn't have looked like that. They couldn't have come up with their own language. They couldn't have done pyramids without an African monarch society coming over and teaching them how to do things. And fundamentally, I think it's very...
I've written a very detailed critique of the book, and actually that's a good point about, the indigenous agency is actually very lacking in that book, because in my critique, one of the points that I made is, Van Sertima claims that these statues represent Africans and that the indigenous people built monuments to Africans. So it's the question of, why would they have built such large and detailed monuments to strangers who were lost? Because in Van Sertima's writings, he makes it clear that the Nubians and Egyptians did not intend to travel to the Americas. They were essentially, they landed there by accident, much of this in the same way that Columbus did. So it's a situation where these people are lost and are strangers. Why would the indigenous people just see these Africans who were lost and decide, we're going to build grand monuments to these strange people who just showed up on our shores?
So, but just quickly, but that's not how it's been a long time, but that's not how I remember it. What I remember his argument being was that, yes, in the initial landing was quite by accident, but then that, in fact, exchange did occur, and that it wasn't to disrespect the indigenous, but to suggest that there was a collaborative, evolving society with Africans who stayed, became part of the community. So that's how I thought he argued the Olmec heads came to be, that it wasn't to pay tribute to strangers, but
I
I'm the one with the issue of time. So I'll let you all. I just wanted to throw that.
I know you got to go. Jared, if you appreciate you for coming through, I can close out. I just got to pull up the slide. So let me share my screen, and then I know you got to go. Thank you, Jared, for joining us. Let me share my screen. Okay. Share.
Well, so the well, let me thank you for organizing this show, Dwayne for coming through and doing the work. I look forward to being, there being many more parts of this. But we're gonna have to wrap this up. We're gonna have to wrap up the show for today here in a minute. And then, do you need me to share this for you? Can you share?
Yeah, you're sharing it now. We are on the last two slides, so we could close out.
But it's not on the screen, though.
Oh, I tried to share mine, and now it's saying, there you go. All right, cool. Yeah. All right, to close out, we will definitely revisit this. It's another book you wrote, or not book, but a brief breakdown you wrote. I think it's very fascinating.
Yes, it's a shorter, shorter.
I think it's great.
I haven't read that. I got to get to that. Yeah,
we'll get to it because I think it's very relevant to what we're discussing now, dialectical materialism and revolutionary African culture, what that actually looks like. Which isn't idealizing the past and sticking to it. Last thing I wanted to close out, if you all want some more information, there is a mini documentary about 15 minutes long by the Walter Rodney Foundation. They have a symposium coming up this year in March in Atlanta. Dr. Patricia Rodney is still around. There's a video where she does a grounding. So just please explore all the rich resources that they've produced and that Walter Rodney keeps giving to our people. Last thing I wanted to close out with today for us is Walter Rodney and his beautiful family who are still around, still organizers, still doing great work. For the only great men among the unfree and the oppressed are those who struggle to destroy the oppressor. So we've been talking about there's no great men in history. I like Rodney's definition of what a great man is. And we can close it there. Appreciate y'all.
Word up. Big thanks to the both of you. Big salute to the undefeated chat. Thanks again, everybody. Josh, again, really great job organizing all of this. Thank you for doing it. And peace, everybody. Only if you're willing to fight for it, as Fred Hampton used to say. And we'll catch you next time here at...
And what do you sacrifice?
Calm. Kindness, kinship, love. I've given up all chance at inner peace. I made my mind a sunless space. I share my dreams with ghosts. I wake up every day to an equation I wrote 15 years ago for which there's only one conclusion. I'm damned for what I do. My anger, my ego, my unwillingness to yield, my eagerness to fight, have set me on a path from which there's no escape. I yearn to be a savior against injustice without contemplating the cost, and by the time I look down, there's no longer any ground beneath my feet. What is my sacrifice? I'm condemned to use the tools of my enemy to defeat them. I burn my decency for someone else's future. I burn my life to make a sunrise that I know I'll never see. Now, the ego that started this fight will never have a mirror or an audience or the light of gratitude. So what do I sacrifice? Everything, 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 everything.
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.